Okay. Well, it's a delight to be here. Um, I love talking about UU history. Before I even connected with UU in a meaningful way, I connected with UU because I found out so many of the people that I admired in American history turned out to be Unitarian or Universalist. So before I talk about Fuller and Emerson, it occurred to me that this is a good Universalist story about mothers for Mother's Day. In the Civil War, it's hard to even describe how much bloodshed there was. Hundreds of thousands of men died on both sides. The women of the North organized to get relief, and they were willing to challenge male authority if they thought, I need to make sure that that soldier gets treatment. So there was a woman named Marianne Bickerdike from Illinois, and she found somebody to take care of her two kids. She was a widow. She showed up at battlefields, and she was particularly vehement about doctors who got drunk before they treated the soldiers. And she was so determined that she angered the doctors. And this one doctor went to General Sherman and said, "Oh, that busybody, how can you let her interfere with us?" And General Sherman said, "I can't help you. She outranks me." And she used the moral authority so they called her Mother Bickerdike. And the way we know about this anecdote is that a woman named Mary Livermore, whose husband was a Universalist minister, wrote a wonderful book called My Story of the War. And she tells about Mother Bickerdike. So, thinking about mothers, honoring mothers, this morning I just thought, oh, Mother Bickerdike. I love that she would take on generals to save the lives of she was known, I might say, I can't go on too long about her, but one of the reasons the men loved her, she would walk a battlefield at night with a lantern, making sure that there was no one alive left there to suffer. Now that takes a lot of guts. So anyhow, I'm in touch with these. I don't believe in a hereafter, so I'm using this metaphorically, but I think that I'm in touch with the spirits, metaphorically, of these great figures from our past because they give us courage. Well, one of my favorite figures in American history is Margaret Fuller. And could we have the first slide? Okay, there's the book that I have here. This is a wonderful Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Margaret Fuller. And now let's look at the next slide. Now this is the only known photograph of Fuller. She was not beautiful, but she had a force of personality that was unbelievable. And then let's look at another slide. This is a magnificent biography of Emerson. And then let's look at the fourth slide. And that's Emerson. This is Emerson at the age of 45. So Margaret Fuller, Emerson was born in 1803, was a Unitarian pastor for a while, and then gave up being a pastor because he said that the ministry was corpse cold. And he was hanging out with Unitarian clergy, but he was not pastoring a church. And in fact, the way he made a living was he gave lectures and he wrote, and his writings were quite successful. Emerson, 1803, Margaret Fuller, 1810. She was the oldest child, and her father, Timothy Fuller, recognized that she was precocious. By 5, she was reading Latin. And then she moved on to Greek, which she preferred. As an adult, she was critical of her father's regimen for her because he treated her like, I mean, it was hard, but he treated her like he would have treated a son, and that was rare. So she had this incredible exposure to classical learning, to world literature. She was multilingual. At one point, she was said to be the best read person, man or woman, in the country. So she was this brilliant woman, but she could not go to Harvard because why? No higher education for women. And she's in Massachusetts, as is Emerson. In 1817, her father was elected to Congress, and they met. I mean, I was astonished to find all the people. He took her to see the aged John Adams. She met the Marquis de Lafayette when he toured the country in 1825. So they were not a wealthy family, but because he was in Congress and because they were part of this circle of intelligentsia, she got acquainted with all kinds of people. Her father died in 1835, and she then realized that she had to be the support for the family. And so she taught at in various venues. How many of you have read Little Women? And you know about Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's father. She taught in his school briefly, but there was one problem with teaching in his school. It didn't pay. So this was not going to solve the family's financial problems. So there's a certain amount of struggle. But then in 1836, I think this, I'm looking at my daughter helped me take notes yesterday. So in 1836, all kinds of important things happened. That's the year she teaches in Alcott School, but Emerson published his first real, how should I put it? It was like a cannon shot across the bow of American culture. It was the first articulation of what would be called transcendentalism. He argued for nature being part and parcel of, we are in nature, nature is in us. And there's a famous sentence, I become a transparent eyeball, he said, in nature, by which he meant that the beauty of nature kind of passed through him. And, there's this almost mystical thing going on. And about that time, she met Emerson. It was inevitable. I mean, it's a small world. They're both living in the Concord area. And by the way, one of the show and tell I brought, I got this a few years ago. The UU Historical Society published this pamphlet. And it's, if you go to Concord, it's all the places you can visit that are connected with Margaret Fuller. So it's pretty cool. So fairly soon after she met Emerson, she visited him for 2 weeks. And do we have the house? I think that's the next slide. Yeah, this is the Emerson house. And it's still standing. It's a national park site. I'm thinking, if it's DEI, is it going to get funded? But anyhow, so it's interesting. Emerson, that biography is entitled, that I showed you, is entitled Mind on Fire. But he was often thought to be somewhat distant. And he had married, when he was 26, he married a lovely young 17-year-old girl who, maybe she was a little older than that, but very younger than he. She died after a brief marriage of tuberculosis. And then he married a woman, Lydian, who was kind of a practical partner, but not the love of his life. So Margaret Fuller shows up. The two of them, Emerson and Fuller, take themselves off to his study and talk. And Lydian is left to keep the house running while all this is going on. And in the biography, there's a wonderful story about how it finally dawned on Margaret Fuller, who was in fact a feminist, that maybe this wasn't entirely fair to Mrs. Emerson. And so she began to be more sensitive. So she's teaching intermittently, and then in 1839, and Emerson is writing, and it's interesting, New England Unitarians were developing reputations abroad. You know, the founding father of the denomination, William Ellery Channing, was someone Charles Dickens wanted to meet when he came in 1840. So anyhow, Emerson is developing a reputation in this country, but also in Europe and in England. He's publishing various essays. And so in 1839, Margaret Fuller begins what's called her conversations. And what were her conversations? She would gather the most brilliant women she knew, and they would talk about philosophy, about German Romanticism, about women's rights. And also in 1839, the Transcendentalists began to form as a group. And now it seems not that shocking, but it was shocking for the day. Emerson asked Margaret Fuller to edit the publication, which was called The Dial. And so you have this group of brilliant intellectuals. Now, interestingly, Lydian was an abolitionist before her husband was. Lydian draped the house in black every 4th of July to critique the presence of slavery. But Emerson is moving more towards being an abolitionist, more towards reform, as is Margaret Fuller. And so for a while, she, just about a year, she edits The Dial. And while she's writing for The Dial, she publishes something in The Dial called The Great Lawsuit, which is men versus women. And that's where she begins to articulate a feminist philosophy. And then a few years later, in 1844, she goes to the New York Tribune. She's the first woman investigative reporter in the country. She goes to prisons. She goes to homes for prostitutes. She finds out what the life of the poor in New York is all about. And she also writes important literary criticism. So what I'm wanting to leave with you is that, well, I'm not quite concluded, but what I want you to understand is that here's this brilliant woman. There is no niche at that time, woman intellectual. She creates it. There is no niche, woman journalist. She creates it. There's no niche, woman literary critic. She creates it. She could be a difficult friend. She was emotionally needy and intense, and sometimes she wanted more people than they were willing to give. So Emerson was not the only one that found her a little much. But at one point she writes something to the effect of, I've met all the great minds, I have this quite a life, that way intellectually, but the life will ever be sweet. So in 1846, she goes to Europe to cover European matters for the New York Tribune. So she's the first woman foreign correspondent. And the reason I wanted to call this a momentous friendship is because if she hadn't had the validation from this famous male intellectual, I think it really helped give her. And when she went to Europe, she had letters of introduction to all kinds of famous people in Europe. So who would you have wanted to meet in Europe in the 1840s? Do any of you, does the name George Sand mean anything to you? The French novelist, mistress of all kinds of famous men, including Frederick Chopin. Apparently when Margaret Fuller got to know George Sand, Chopin gave her a little concert, piano concert. She met the great Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini. She met a great Polish revolutionary, Adam Mickiewicz. So thanks to her own force of personality, thanks to letters of introduction from Emerson, she goes to Europe and she is in contact with, all the main currents of European reform. And of course, in 1848, a revolution breaks out. And the revolution, 1848 is such a year. Seneca Falls, the Gold Rush, the Communist Manifesto, revolution in Germany, revolution in France, and revolution in Italy. And what does Margaret Fuller do at this point? She goes to Italy. Mazzini recruits her to go to Italy. And she throws herself into nursing and being, part of the Italian Revolution. But, and now, I think I got a little bit ahead of myself. The next slide. Yeah, that's the Beecher one. Okay, I wanted to show you this book, The Most Famous Man in America, about Henry Ward Beecher. One of the reasons I'm so interested in these people is that, as many of you know, I wrote a book about California in the Civil War and used Thomas Starr King, the Unitarian minister in San Francisco, as kind of the centerpiece. And I read hundreds of his letters. And therefore, I feel like these people are personal friends because I read the letters and it was so interesting. Well, there's one letter that I found where Starr King is writing to one of his buddies and he says, "Oh, I visited Emerson and I imitated Henry Ward Beecher for Emerson." And Emerson was very amused. And just the whole idea of, imitating a famous mainstream clergyman for Emerson, I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall. But I never found Starr King writing about Margaret Fuller, unfortunately. Oh, well. Okay, next slide. So, this is Horace Greeley, who recruited her to write for the New York Tribune. And then next slide. Yes. So when she goes to Italy, not only does she throw herself into
I think you should listen to this.
Italian Revolution, but she meets a young Italian nobleman, Count Osoli, and they become lovers. No one has ever found a marriage certificate, which isn't to say it doesn't exist, but she gave birth to a child in the middle of the revolution. and took refuge in a little village. And it was, again, when you read the biography, Adam Mickiewicz, this famous Polish revolutionary who was in France because Russia was dominating Poland, what a surprise. They became very close, and Mickiewicz is writing to her, you've got to have courage, you can do it, you can handle this. Well, the revolution fails. Count Osily has a title, but he doesn't have any means of support or money. And so Margaret, her Italian partner, by whatever means, and their child get on board a ship to come to the US to see what they can do here. And it got as far as Fire Island in New York, right off the shore of New York. And the ship was wrecked. And everything, many people were able to get to shore. It was that close to Fire Island. But Margaret and Osily and the child all drowned. Their bodies were never recovered. The child's body washed up on the sea. So in Cambridge, there's Mount Auburn Cemetery, there's a memorial to her, and the only body there is that of the little boy, who was, I think, 2. She had been writing her memoirs of the Italian Revolution. That manuscript was lost. Emerson sent Thoreau to see if he could find any remnants, but sadly, no. And there were people who said things like, well, she would not have fit into the US with her outrageous lifestyle. So her reputation suffered from the fact that there were all these suspicions about the nature of, was this a bastard in essence? But most of the feminists in this country and reformers saw her as she was, a great hero. Anybody who's been around the UU Fellowship and seen me knows I cry easily. So anyhow, here's this woman who lived this incredible life, who had the courage that I just can't imagine having the courage that she had. And she left a wonderful, inspiring legacy. In the 19th century, a lot of women's groups of feminists, they called themselves Osily clubs. Now, you see, they wanted to make sure that they claimed her as a married woman. So it wasn't Margaret Fuller clubs, it was Osily clubs. They did have to protect her respectability. But she also, the articles that she published in the Dial, The Great Lawsuit, eventually became a book, Woman in the 19th Century, in which she said about women, let them be sea captains if they will. And, she means a lot to me. Mwah, to her memory. Thank you.